If there was any issue up for debate in this year's race for city council, it was over the cost of housing and how to make it more affordable. There were arguments for rent control or other ways to relieve the rising pressures of displacement. There were also mailings from the Small Property Owners Association that a return of rent control 25 years after its repeal could pose widespread problems. Tonight we hear from the group's executive director and newsletter editor, Skip Schloming. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Skip, if you look at what's happened, at least in Boston, over the 25 years since we last had rent control, prices going through the roof, lots of new supply, at least under Mayor Walsh. So, I mean, was your prediction right about what would happen if we had kept rent control?
I don't understand quite the
question.
Well,
let's say if we had kept rent control, I think your argument was that we wouldn't have the kind of supply that we have today.
Okay, yes. Number one, rent control stops all new rental housing construction. No one is going to, even the gentleman you had, if there was a threat of rent control, and there is one throughout the whole state, there's a local option rent control bill at the state legislature allowing any community to adopt it. With that risk, someone like the person you talked to would close down that project completely. So all new housing construction stops. So you have to choose. You either want to have more housing, which is the real problem. The economists are saying it over and over again. It's lack of supply that's pushing the rents up. And it's reasonable to say about Boston that our problem comes a lot from the high-tech community and a lot of people coming to Boston with high incomes that can afford to, spend more on the rent and are consuming more of the limited housing supply. So the fundamental problem really is how to increase the supply. And we have, the Small Property Owners Association has come out with a new proposal, just recently formulated, and it's based on the fact that I have been executive director of the Small Property Owners Association for 25 years, with a couple of years missing. And I'm a sociologist with a PhD from Brandeis University. So for 25 years, I've been looking at the rental housing market, in two ways, from a landlord perspective, but the sociology perspective. And one of the key problems is that household size has shrunk over the years. So the housing that we now have, that's the basic rental housing supply stock in Massachusetts, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, everywhere, was mainly built between 1840 and 1920. Older housing, beautiful housing, it's lasted very well, but it was originally built for wealthy families, large in size, or for large immigrant families. Again, large-sized units, because the immigrant families would have multiple children, aunts and uncles and grandparents living in one unit. So now the household size has shrunk dramatically. And the new high-tech people coming in are sometimes just one-person households. But I was saying Boston's household units, 2/3 of them consist of just one or two persons living in large apartments built for immigrant families. So yeah, it's okay to have more space, but I think you could say we're overhoused.
Yeah, overhoused and overpriced at the same time.
Sure.
So how do you solve
how do we deal
that?
with that? Well, we're doing something. We're suggesting something that has not been mentioned. There's a lot of talk about accessory dwelling units, and that's fine, but that's okay. But that's a limited supply that's there. We're suggesting that large apartments be allowed to be subdivided into two smaller ones. And when I came here in 1964 to go to graduate school, I lived in a triple-decker unit that had been subdivided. And I had a roommate. What was originally the parlor and the dining room were turned into 2 bedrooms, and it was a large eat-in kitchen, and that's all we needed. If we had guests, we met in the kitchen. And next door was a 1-bedroom unit out of the bedrooms of the original triple-decker apartment. And of course we took it because it was more inexpensive. So what we're suggesting is we can increase the supply of smaller sized units substantially by allowing large apartments to be subdivided. And here's the trick, here's the important key idea. If people living now in large apartments move into some of these smaller units, it's one of the easiest ways to economize on your rent is just to get a smaller unit. And they will be available. They aren't available now. They're almost as expensive. A studio or a one bedroom is almost as expensive as a two bedroom right now. So they're in high demand. So owners will build these units. You don't even need any tax subsidies. You don't need anything, just let them do it. And the supply is potentially very huge. As people in larger apartments move into a smaller size unit, they're releasing their large apartment for others to move into. So by increasing the supply of smaller sized units, we expand the supply of all sized units of all sizes. So we think this is the best way to go because private owners will do it. The apartments will be naturally affordable. You don't need to restrict the rents on them. They'll be smaller. They will not have fancy amenities. And they won't disturb our beautiful neighborhoods, the historic housing, because they're built inside the building envelope, as we say it. There may be an entrance on the side. You may allow a dormer, but many houses already have dormers. So it's a good way to go. And we're also in favor of accessory dwelling units, which would use empty attics or empty basements or empty garages. That's fine. But those are limited in terms of how many that would be. And so this is a substantial supply. We think it's so substantial, in fact, that we wouldn't want the density that it would produce. So our proposal at least suggests let's start off allowing them along the main corridors because it's perfect. You can't impose parking requirements for these or they won't happen. So they need to happen near public transportation, and that's the way of the future, as the fellow before you us talked about in their project that was in Revere. They need to use the blue line, I guess, and that's what we need.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Skip Schloming from the Small Property Owners Association. Skip, there's one kind of building that's under a lot of displacement pressure right now, these big brick box buildings, a lot of them along the Fairmount Indigo corridor in Boston. These are not your classic three-deckers. They usually have maybe just one or two bedrooms. And right now, tenants are facing these really steep increases. The buildings need some work. So what should be done with properties like that?
So these are larger properties. My experience is mostly with the historic housing. If it's brick construction, they may need to be renovated. If those are larger units, they could be subdivided too. You could have, one-bedroom units for a 1 and 2 person household is really all you need. So what we can't do is do something that inhibits the creation of smaller sized units. And the things that inhibit, for number one, rent control just stops, it's dead. No one's going to build something that's going to have a controlled rent, even if it's technically exempt.
I mean, you're saying there's no city in all of this country where they have rent control of some kind, where developers aren't putting up anything?
Well, I can say this. When we had rent control in Cambridge for 25 years, it was zero production. Now, Cambridge had a fairly strict system, but we already are seeing signs of people moving out of rent-controlled jurisdictions, the developers and builders, because these laws can be amended. They can say no new construction will be rent-controlled ever, but that's just one amendment away to being rent-controlled on property. So the builders just won't do it. They won't risk building in a rent-controlled jurisdiction. There may be a few exceptions, but it just doesn't happen. The other thing that's important is not to put an affordability restriction on housing, especially privately owned. I mean, if it's tax-funded housing, that's a different thing, but that supply is very tiny. The amount of housing that we can build that's affordable with tax money is very limited. So we're urging the private market to be allowed to be developed, and it's just zoning changes that would allow these smaller sized units to be built. You don't need to restrict the units to being affordable. That's death to any landlord wanting to create a new affordable housing, a new lower rent, smaller sized unit. And you also don't want to have inclusionary zoning. That's a serious problem. When you have inclusionary zoning, that means the city or town is requiring a minimum number of affordable units. But what does that do? It pushes the rents up on all the other units, which is counterproductive.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Skip Schloming from the Small Property Owners Association.
Thank you.
We'll have more news in just a moment.